Deborah by Josephine Tey. Read by Miss Worm. It was on our way home after a few days at the coast that we found it. The cottage, I mean. We had made a detour in order to inspect the new racecourse at Pontbridge, and it was in the, to us, unexplored country between there and Dorking that we came across it. It stood on a knoll, about 300 yards outside as pretty a village as you'll find in Sussex, and it looked like a picture in a fairy tale book. I had an impression of white lilac and a laburnum tree at the gate. I heard Lisbeth gasp, and she twisted in the seat at my side and craned her neck till she couldn't see it any more. We were in the village street before she suggested going back for a closer inspection, and I had to point out that we were late as it was. I have never really liked driving in the dark, since I used to skate round shell holes on 2 wheels with intermittent illumination on the Bethune Road. Besides, I said, the board you're talking about probably reads W. Higson Sweep and has nothing to do with letting the place. She said, "All right, George, I expect you do need dinner rather badly. Did you notice the lilacs?" We were nearly home before she spoke again. There was an illustration in my Grimm like that. Hansel and Gretel, I think it was. And at dinner, apropos apparently of bottled peas, she said, there were little crooked apple trees at the side. At intervals through the week, I remembered the place, or rather, I had occasional pictures of it at the back of my mind when I was thinking of totally different matters. And yet, when Lisbeth said, next Saturday morning at breakfast, "We're going to start early today and go round by that cottage," something made me say, "What cottage?" "You know," she said, and I had a queer feeling of being found out. When we pulled up at the little green gate in the hedge, Lisbeth clicked her tongue the way she always does when she's scored off me, for the notice board, planted drunkenly at one corner of the garden, read "To Let." There the information ended. There was no "apply to" or "at." We went back to the village, and in a thatched post office got the information that we wanted. The cottage was most certainly to let, and the key was to be had at Halkett's. Halkett's was the farm on the slope behind the cottage. The cottage had belonged to an old woman, a childless widow, and she had died about 8 years ago, come June. The present owner was a grandnephew of the old woman, who lived in New Zealand and had never seen the place. He was sort of sentimental about the cottage, though, and wouldn't sell it. It was only to let, and the Halketts looked after it. We took ourselves to Halkett's, where a large damsel in blue gingham, her enormous arms bare to the elbow and still damp, announced that she would fetch Miss Halkett to us, and clattered down the cool tiled passage with the threat still on her lips. Miss Halkett proved to be a replica of her maid, perhaps a pound or 2 less, and a shade lighter on her feet. A pleasant, practical girl. She fetched the key and accompanied us down the field path to the cottage. We should have preferred to explore it alone, but could not very well refuse her chaperonage. She preceded us into the living room and drew aside the curtains that hung across the latticed windows. "Why," said Lisbeth, "it's furnished." "Oh, yes. The nephew I was telling you of said it was to stay just the way it was when old Deborah died, and tenants were to be taken only on that condition. We look after it when it isn't let." In spite of the emptiness of the wide hearth, the room had a pleasant look, very welcoming. It was, moreover, an authentic cottage interior. There were no Liberty cretons, no rush mats, no colour scheme. The curtains, as Lisbeth remarked afterwards, were made of flowered chintz at a few pence a yard, and the possibly valuable bits of china on the mantelpiece were cheek by jowl with the kind of tea-caddy a grocer gives away at Christmas, and souvenirs of half a dozen watering places. Nothing in the room had been placed there for its effect. Each article was there because of its value to the owner, and yet, in spite of that, or perhaps because of it, the room had a charm that no arranged room in my experience ever had, and the rest of the house was the same. We moved out of doors and stood looking at the place in a sort of speechless satisfaction. On one side, the garden was bounded by a row of white lilac trees, heavy with bloom. At the back, rather close to the house, were aspen poplars, the kind that make a sound like rain when the lightest wind comes, and on the grass at the other side were Lisbeth's crooked little apple trees. By the road ran a very low hedge of box, and a narrow brick path went up to the door, but not round the house. There was no back door, and the grass, unbroken by any flower beds, grew close up to the walls. It was no show place, inside or out, but it had a most definite charm. All buildings have an atmosphere of some kind or other. Laburnum Cottage, for that was its prosaic name, had an air of primness. It wasn't smug, not even complacent, but there was a happy, well-orderedness about it. It both deprecated and disowned the tipsy notice board. The unmown grass had the incongruous effect of dishevelled hair on a carefully dressed woman, and yet it wasn't in its physical peculiarities that the primness lay. You can get an ordered effect with poplars or cypress or trimmed box, but lilacs are not exactly prim, and the laburnum at the gate was positively wanton. The primness hung in the atmosphere itself, somehow. As we came back to the living room, Lisbeth said, "You keep it beautifully, Miss Halkett. We shall have something to live up to." Facial expression is the subtlest thing on earth. What is the difference between a pleased blush and an uncomfortable flush? Something too indefinite for words, isn't it? And yet as definite as daylight. It was certainly an uncomfortable flush that showed in Miss Halkett's honest visage at the moment, and she turned with obvious relief to follow Lisbeth, who had been examining a piece of lustreware, for a second inspection of the kitchen. Now, why? We left the place some 10 minutes later, its accepted tenants, and Lisbeth's parting words to Miss Halkett were, "And do take down the board at once, won't you? It's a blot." All the way to the coast she was jubilant, the burden of her song being that it should be our luck to get it when country cottages were at a premium. "Perhaps there's a snag somewhere," I suggested. "Don't let's crow too soon." "George, you unbearable wet blanket," she said. "I shan't be damped by you. I just shan't. If you want to be liverish on a glorious spring morning on our way to the sea through a country reeking of lilac, you'll have to do it without my hitherto unfailing sympathy." And certainly it would be difficult to find a snag in the perfect days we spent at the cottage. We would let the Halketts know when we were coming down, and they had the place open, clean, and aired for us. They supplied us with milk, butter, and eggs, chicken, ducks, and salad. The weather all the summer was the kind that leaves one in no doubt. We spent the long, brilliant days in the garden on the little patch of shaved turf, I working in a deck chair, Lisbeth supine in a hammock slung from the lilac trees. Little flaws of wind ran in a whispering patter through the aspen poplars and ceased abruptly, as if afraid of being overheard. Our flowered chintz flapped lazily at the yawning windows, and over the tops of the trees across the road, the blue Sussex distances shimmered in the sun. In July, when London was a blazing furnace, we migrated altogether to Laburnum Cottage. It was then that the change in Lisbeth began. She grew listless and nervy. I blamed the long heat wave and wished that I could take her for a sea voyage, but a country cottage was the best we could do. She woke to animation sometimes when Mary Halkett would look in on passing, and would discuss with every appearance of interest our predecessors in the role of tenant, especially the former owner. I had the impression that the Halkett girl was not quite at her ease at these moments, and I wondered which of the tenants had been the undesirable one. But she was frank enough, and showed no disposition to avoid us. She remembered old Mrs. Marget's only vaguely, but such recollection as she had was evidently pleasant. "Everyone liked her," she said. "She was a sweet old woman." "Was she house-proud?" asked Lisbeth surprisingly. "Well, she was awfully fond of her cottage, if that's what you mean." Later on, Lisbeth said, "How is it that none of the other tenants wanted to hang on to a little heaven like this?" It was a question we often asked each other, and we both turned to our visitor. On Mary Halkett's face was the expression of one who sees a step just in time. It was gone, even as I turned, and she said evenly, "Well, 'tis a very lonely spot, and once summer's gone, not so very attractive. Most of the tenants were the kind who liked to go to a different place every year," which seemed a reasonable enough explanation. But when we were left alone again, Lisbeth would sink back to her strange, rapt listlessness, and she grew more and more queer in her fads. She gave up the hammock because it didn't belong. Apparently it was out of the picture, and took to sitting at the door in a hard wooden chair with a thin turkey-red cushion as the only mitigant of its penitential qualities. And then, one evening at the end of July, after a grey, dusty day, sultry and full of the promise of storm, we arrived back from a short walk along the parched lanes. Lisbeth had gone in front of me through the open door, and was standing apparently gazing down at the table where the evening meal was set. "Oh, I don't like it," she said suddenly, with such passion that it took my breath away. The chicken salad on the table was one of her favourite dishes, but the best course was to humour her, I thought. "There's some cold beef in the larder," I said. "Shall I get you that?" To my surprise, she turned with a shaky little laugh. "Oh, you prosaic darling," she said. Then her smile died away. She came close up to me and peered half searchingly, half confidingly into my face. "Have you ever noticed the queer thing about the house?" And as I struggled for words in my astonishment, she added, "No, I don't suppose a man would notice." "Well, look at the room. There's been a wind all day, and clouds of dust have been drifting over the garden. The doors and the windows have been open since morning, and there isn't a speck of dust in the room. And it's always like that." Her voice rose hysterically. "No dust anywhere." It sounded perilously like an anticlimax to her dramatic question, but less so when I searched round my brain for an explanation that might meet the situation. There didn't seem to be one at hand somehow, and the longer I searched, the more at sea I became. To my unbounded relief, however, Elizabeth lapsed suddenly from the borders of hysteria to her normal calm. She sat down at the table and began to serve, and I followed her example. It was rather a silent meal. "You know," I said at last, "there must be a perfectly ordinary explanation. A draught that acts as a vacuum cleaner, or something of that sort. Some quite reasonable explanation." She was silent, crumbling her bread. Then she said, rather absently, "Oh, perfectly reasonable." But I had a feeling that she did not mean exactly what I did. We dropped the subject, and next morning the weather broke and we went back to town. For a month I was so busy that we had no chance of getting away, even at the weekends, and then, quite unexpectedly, I had a free Saturday and Sunday. It was hot, and very much the fag end of August in town, and I tentatively suggested the cottage. To my surprise, Lisbeth, who had quite recovered her good spirits, seemed not only willing, but glad. I heard her humming as we packed, and I called through to her. "There won't be time to let the Halketts know, but I don't expect we'll starve." It wasn't a pleasant journey down. The whole countryside was crying aloud for water. The wind was blustering, and pillars of dust that looked as high as the Nelson Monument would rise in front of us, and just as we reached their base, would deliberately, it seemed, collapse upon us. The hedge and the trees outside Laburnum Cottage were grey with dust, and the grass looked shabby. Lisbeth went up to Halkett's for the key, while I tinkered with the engine before consigning it to the mercies of the garage late blacksmith in the village. "There was no one to be seen at Halkett's," she said when she came back, "so I just took the key off the nail." I joined her at the door and went into the living room with her. Do you know the feeling you have sometimes when entering a room that has just that moment been vacated? You didn't see or hear a door closing, but you have the impression that someone went out as you came in. Well, there wasn't another door in the living room at Laburnum Cottage, but I most distinctly had that feeling. Lisbeth was examining the shining spick and span room with interest. "I just wanted to be sure," she said, inconsequently. "The Halketts must have cleaned up on the chance of our coming," I said, ignoring her remark and its possible application. "No," she said, just like that, as if she knew all about it. "Look here," I said, exasperated. "Come up to Halkett's with me, and I'll lay you 50 to 1 in pounds that they've been here either today or yesterday." "All right," she said. We walked up to the farm in silence, I feeling ridiculous and rather angry, Lisbeth apparently serene. We met Mary Halkett by the barn. If one glance at her face was enough for us, I think her glance at us must have been equally enlightening. "You didn't expect us," said Lisbeth, and I have never heard a more conventional question. It had the unaccented tone of one discussing the weather. "No," said Miss Halkett. "No, or I'd have... No." "It doesn't matter," said Lisbeth. "We're not staying. We looked in on our way to Bognor to collect some things. We're leaving the cottage to Deborah." Mary Halkett put down the can she was carrying as if suddenly incapable of bearing its weight. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she cried. "So sorry. You've been the nicest people we've ever... You like the place so much that I thought she might... But I was afraid back in July that you'd noticed, and she wouldn't let up. But you're not angry, are you? There's no harm in the cottage, only the queerness." "No," said Lisbeth, still in the same serene way. "Not a bit angry. For myself, I'm rather glad to have known the place. And, you see, I have a sympathy with Deborah. I'm awfully attached to sticks and stones myself. Would be quite happy to think that Deborah has the cottage all to herself until the end of our lease. Wouldn't we, George?" "Yes," I said, making with difficulty my sole contribution to this incredible conversation. Miss Halkett then offered us something to eat at the farm, which we refused, but we each had a glass of milk, just to show there was no ill will, as Lisbeth said afterwards. I drove down to Bognor in a dazed condition. As we sighted the sea, Lisbeth seemed to wake up from a trance. She gave a little amused snort and said, "Isn't it ludicrous that in these days of shortage of labour we refuse to have anything to do with a cottage that dusts itself?" It is ludicrous, isn't it? But we're going down to the coast next weekend, and I owe Lisbeth a call of 50, which I'm hoping she won't remember. And worst of all, something I don't understand keeps me from saying, "I told you so."